Well, hello again. Here's another one of my yes or no questions. This one is: was the Norman Conquest of England a bad thing? Of course, I could have phrased it as was it a good thing, but I chose to do it that way. The Norman Conquest, as I guess just about everyone who is probably watching this video would know, was perhaps the most important date in the history of England. The Norman Conquest involved the invasion by William, the Duke of Normandy, and with a little bit of help from some of his neighbors as well, to come across the Channel, meet the forces of King Harold at Hastings, near the south coast of England. Some debate about whether the battle actually took place at Hastings, but in that general area, which William won, had himself crowned King of England fairly quickly, and over the next 5 years finished the conquest by battling various rebellious elements, and left its mark, certainly very permanently, on the country, and of course became the ruling dynasty from which all subsequent kings and queens of England are descended, if indeed they are actually descended from him. But I guess that's a DNA question, really. Okay. Well, let's first look at the yes group, those who say, oh, yes, indeed, it was a bad thing. It was very, very bad for the nation. Well, I suppose the starting point here is that, like many such battles and conquests, it was really an event of kind of mafia-type thuggery, really. It was one man saying, I want all this for myself, and I don't care how many people I kill in the process, I'm going to have it. William, of course, was in competition with several others, the existing King Harold and another candidate from Scandinavia, and in fact even another sleeper from England. Well, they all wanted the same thing, didn't they? They wanted it for themselves no matter what the cost was. So anyway, that's a kind of an unpleasant background element to the conquest, but it is one from which basically all royal dynasties spring. They are warlords, they're thugs, they defeat anyone and everyone in their path until they succeed and then become royal. Well, number two, in the process of putting his stamp on England, William behaved pretty viciously, especially in an event called the Harrying of the North. There were a series of rebellions in the north of England over a period of several years, and William's forces simply went north and basically destroyed every area where there was any sense of rebellion. They butchered the animals, burned the crops, razed the villages, killed any opponents in their way, and left much of the north of England in a state of total devastation. So much so that there were actually migrations of people, mothers with children starving to death, moving southward, looking for food, really, and some form of redress. A bit kind of embarrassingly reminiscent of what's going on in some parts of the world today. Number three, in the process of pacifying the British Isles, a number of military initiatives by William and his men, particularly in Ireland and in Wales, were particularly cruel and engendered resentment, antipathy that has perhaps lasted to this day. He put a permanent stamp of unpleasantness on those relationships, and in many respects we're still feeling the result of that today. That's a pretty good reason to say it was a bad thing. And then finally, and from the standpoint of some people, no less important, is the fact that virtually all of the existing aristocratic population of the country at the time of the conquest was displaced. The lands and territories of England were given to men who fought alongside William at Hastings, and the English were just simply kicked out. Many were emigrated, some, interestingly enough, to an organization called the Varangian Guard, which was a kind of a bodyguard and Praetorian Guard for the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople. They must have been pretty good fighters to be hired for that purpose, and quite a few of them did so. Well, anyway, there's a series of pretty good reasons for saying this was a bad thing. It was a pretty violent, oppressive, unpleasant, power-grabbing, self-aggrandizing endeavor on the part of William. So, who might disagree? Who might say, well, actually, it wasn't a bad thing? Well, I suppose one of the first and most obvious points on the those who support the fact that it was really not a bad thing at all is the creation of the Anglo-English Norman language, the English language as we know it now. Prior to the invasion, the nation spoke a Germanic language that we now know of as Anglo-Saxon, and the invaders spoke Norman French, and those two languages morphed over the centuries. The English as we know it absorbed many Latinate words from the French, and eventually resulted in an extraordinarily rich language, the language of Shakespeare. Kind of hard to imagine the works of Shakespeare in Anglo-Saxon. Certainly it would have been a bit harder to understand, but maybe we'd all be just as conversant with Anglo-Saxon. So it's a bit of a hypothetical exercise, but my guess it would not have had the poetic, melodic ring that it does today. Second, the Normans were great administrators. They did encounter a nation that was quite well organized and managed, but the Normans improved upon that considerably. They, of course, initiated the famous Doomsday Book, where they recorded all the property and assets in England in great detail, and formed the basis for an equitable, I guess you might say, taxing system. They introduced accounting measures. They were a pretty civilized bunch, so they did advance good government and administration considerably. Number three, they greatly expanded the monastic community. There were monks and monasteries in England before the conquest, during the Anglo-Saxon period, but not many. The Normans greatly increased this, particularly the Benedictine monasteries, but Augustinians and so forth. In balance, the strength and expansion of the monasteries, who were given land grants by the conqueror, was probably a good thing. The monks were certainly bastions of learning and education. They preserved many of the classic books, which might have not survived to this day. They were educators, they were intellectuals, they were also, in many respects, scientists. They were ornithologists, botanists. There was a lot of positive influence. Of course, there was some negative influence as well. There was a lot of corruption and bad behavior among some monasteries, but they got corrected eventually, and eventually completely corrected by Henry VIII, who abolished them altogether. Next, the Normans, of course, were very accomplished soldiers, demonstrated, of course, by their victory over Harold, although it was a close-run thing. And in the very early days of their tenure in England, they vastly expanded the nation's military capability with the building of defensive castles, organizing military units around local fiefdoms, and basically built the nation's capability, which of course eventually served them very well when they started during the 100 Years' War, going back to war with France again. How ironic that it was the French who taught the English how to beat the French, in a way. That, although one might not think that being a warlike is not necessarily a benefit, it's pretty good if you have to defend yourself. And finally, one of the most noteworthy legacies of the Norman Conquest, particularly here in Canterbury, is the wonderful introduction of French and Norman cathedral building and architectural style. The capabilities they brought to this endeavor were just amazing. The cathedrals started going up at a very fast pace, and of course within a century were converted into their Gothic style, which again was also a French influence. And they are among the most magnificent visiting artistic experiences available in England, and we have really William the Conqueror and his successors to thank for that. Maybe it would have come later, but that certainly was an immediate effect. Well, what's my take on all of this? It's very hard really to defend the violence and the brutality of the conquest and all that it entailed. And of course, we can't really know how the nation would have prospered and how it would have fared had the conquest not taken place. We can't even know what the military success of the nation would have been without the underpinning of the Norman dynasty. But we certainly know the impact of the language, the wonderful, nuanced, comprehensive, widespread language that we now know as English, really unrivaled in the world in so many respects, and widespread in terms of its impact everywhere in the world. So for that reason, I guess I'll have to kind of cautiously say, yes, it was a good thing. So there it is. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, give me a like, subscribe, make a few comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.